Welcome to episode 42 of The Lowdown Show. I'm Neil Graham. This week, I speak to Brian Price, a man who's invested an inordinate amount of time and energy attempting to get to the root of the lyric opera that is all things KTM. And an interesting footnote is that Mr. Price is not a journalist, but rather the proprietor of an Oregon-based gear retailer. But before we get into our conversation with Brian, a word from our sponsor. Picture this. You're halfway through a DIY motorcycle fix, tools scattered everywhere, and boom, you realize you're missing a part. But it's okay because you know whatever it is, it's on eBay. They've got everything. Brake rotors, lights, and tire exhaust systems, whatever you need, and it's guaranteed to fit, which means no more crossing your fingers and hoping you order the right thing. All the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love. Brian, I think what interested me most of all when I read your four-part, including a bonus fifth chapter we'll get today from you live, when I read it on Facebook, and it was brought to my attention by Zach Kurlick, who's the editor of ADV Rider, and we were impressed at what good journalism it was. Now, you're a guy in Oregon who runs a Moto store. And what are you doing on Facebook writing a really perceptive review of KTM's woes? So take me to that point.
Sometimes I like a project. And at this time, I'm not in the middle of a motorcycle project. And I had read some of what was going on with KTM. And my first article was a sort of commentary on them from a product management perspective, which is my background prior to the business that I have now. And I've always had some thoughts about how they execute the product strategy, what it is, and how they execute it. And I saw it as an opportunity to put those down in paper and publicize them. And in the course of being a little bit extra prepared for that, which is my nature, I started discovering more and more detail about this story. And then when I put out the first segment of it, I got a lot of positive feedback. And by that time, I was kind of hooked. It's just a fantastic story and really interesting. And so I just decided that I was going to write a second part, and that began a third and a fourth, and it's probably going to continue to go. I think the takeaway from that is just how complex, but also how fascinating what is happening with KTM right now is.
Well, as they say, let's start at the beginning. So your first chapter, you talk, and you alluded to a little bit of it just there. I mean, you talked about KTM's unusual, in your view, product strategy, which I think can be summed up by the term madly off in all directions. Correct me if I'm wrong. And you also said that it wasn't so much a product strategy, but an acquisition strategy. So can you sort of take me through your views on some of those things?
Sure. When you are in the product engine of a company, be it apparel or in this case motorcycles, you work with other departments to try and come up with things to make, and those typically are something that is unique, something that has a higher level of performance, something that is more economical, has better value, or sometimes you make what I call line fillers, which is the analogy I always use is if you're at a restaurant, you have to have a hamburger on the menu just because someone is going to expect that, and they won't come to your restaurant unless you do. And in KTM's case, they started off being extraordinarily unique and innovative, and they found niches in the industry that weren't properly filled. And in my opinion, the best thing, the coolest thing about that is they figured out those niches not from looking at data or spreadsheets or anything like that, but by properly identifying what motorcycles they should be making. And that's as core as it gets. But over time, what they shifted to, because of them buying other brands, was what I believe to be a sort of top-down strategy mandated from above, saying, okay, now we have these other brands and we have to leverage them and create product for them. And so, of course, the easiest way, the shortest path to doing that is just to utilize the designs that they already had with KTM badge on it. And that's a redundant exercise, right? That's redundancy. And so it's not compelling. It doesn't really offer a higher level of performance. In fact, the performance metric that you compare it to is the other KTM brands. It's not less economical. They were going to do that with gas initially, but they did not. And it's not really
And so
you're
you're talking specifically about KTM buying Husqvarna and gas, and essentially just badge engineering them in the existing KTMs into these other models. I mean, as someone who doesn't know much about these things, what is the advantage of doing that? Why would General Motors have a Chevrolet, an Oldsmobile, once I'm dating myself here, a Chevy, an Oldsmobile, and a Buick that are all essentially the same car with slightly different colors or trim levels? What's within product development? What is the supposed advantage of that approach?
At the time, the person who was running General Motors said, we have a brand for every pocketbook. So its intent was to address different levels of economic income, right? Different demographics. And that's not necessarily a bad strategy. It certainly worked in the early 1900s. But I remind you, and everybody that cites that strategy failed, right? They dropped Oldsmobile, they dropped Pontiac, and they consolidated some of the other brands. Chrysler had Plymouth, and they dropped that brand, and so it stopped working at a certain point, or became obsolete. And to answer the other part of your question, what's the benefit of it? Well, I would say there's also more differentiation in what General Motors was offering over the years than there is between a KTM and a Husqvarna and a gas.
Because with motorcycles, you're limited to, you can't add Naugahyde. Well, I guess you could add Naugahyde, but you can't add nearly as much Naugahyde or a vinyl roof.
Vinyl roofs, right?
As you can on a car. So essentially, they're much narrower. And the only explanation I was told for the Husqvarna purchase was, somebody seeing a KTM dealer saying, well, it's for people that don't like the color orange, which seems kind of weak to me.
I think that there was some merit, some value in them buying Husqvarna because of the strength of the brand. It's such a historic brand, and has so many cool things that are part of that brand, from Steve McQueen to some really innovative motorcycles. And so that made some sense to me. I questioned it a little bit because it also a little bit redundant. But when it happened, everybody, at least myself, I was imagining that there would be some more differentiation than they eventually had. They killed some of the models that Husaberg had. I was expecting them to rebadge those as Husqvarnas, but they really consolidated the I'll call it the design or the platform into more similar models than different. And then when they bought gas, that just didn't make any sense. The trials market is not large enough to sustain a brand like that, or certainly be interesting. KTM could have just made trials bikes and been fantastically successful at it, and probably put gas out of business. So I don't really know why they bought it. There is one benefit to that strategy, which is distribution related. And that is, the sales team will always talk about how many doors do we have? How many outlets do we have for a product? And the more outlets you have for your product, the easier it is for the customer to come in contact with it.
Right.
And so that was a nice advantage to adding multiple brands. But to do that, and to do that properly, especially in the modern world, you have to have duplicate branding, or unique branding. You have to have unique communication marketing. You have to have lots of duplicated sales staff and infrastructure. And when you double or triple your product line by adding brands, you don't double or triple your sales, you increase them incrementally. And in fact, the more brands you add, I would argue that the more that increment shrinks, gets smaller.
What's baffled me about the KTM situation is it seemed to me, vis-a-vis buying all these other brands, and I always think that the joke is, when you buy MV Agusta, you've lost your mind, because how many times has MV Agusta sold for €1? Like, you and I, regular guys, could buy MV Agusta. Now, we couldn't assume the debt, Natch, but we could afford to buy the company. So when they bought MV Agusta, I thought, okay, Stefan Pierre is off to the moon. But But it seemed like KTM had kind of the perfect reputation because they in the off-road world, they managed to be a mainstream off-road brand and yet still have the cachet of a boutique brand like Ducati or Moto or something like that. And yet they sold their off-road stuff in Japanese kind of numbers. So it
Mhm.
seemed to me that KTM really kind of had the perfect thing going, and then they went off in all these different directions. It sounds mad to me.
It is on many levels, and that's one of them. I think in the off-road world, there was a space, a product space, a marketing space above what the Japanese were offering, and that's what they exploited. That's what they went into, and that's what they exploited. There isn't really that in the street side of things. That's it's much more competitive, and the numbers are much bigger. There's much more at stake, and also their whole philosophy, which you can see. One thing I really admire about them from a branding perspective, and someone who knows a little bit about branding, not a ton, but they have this model ready to race. And that permeated every level of the company. And you can see how they actually, I could picture them in a product planning meeting discussing whatever model or product they were going to come out with and saying, hey, is this ready to race? Well, our consumers think that this is raceable. And man, what a nice filter. What a nice threshold to have to cross. What a good aid to making a decision that is. It's not as useful when you start to expand your line out into more and more displacements and trying to reach more and more of the more casual segments of the market, which is what happens in street. And so maybe that's another reason that that Husqvarna or Gas could have made sense, perhaps even MV Agusta, although I agree with you. But the key thing about that is they did not do that. They did not utilize that strategy or plan. They didn't position the other brands that they acquired in any different way other than the KTM. And I can only assume that that came from the top down.
You have been fairly critical of Stefan Pierer, and we should maybe you can run us through this because it isn't the peer group. Just for those who don't follow these things as we do, the peer group oversees all these different brands, and the man at the top, Stefan Pierer. What do you know about him?
I have some secondhand feedback that I've gotten from people. After I wrote the first article, I did have a few people that reached out to me that have more familiarization with him than I do. And there's not a lot written about him in the United States. There's quite a bit of coverage of him in Europe. And I spent a lot of time digging through and sifting through that. And I don't have a good insider's opinion, but I think I have an opinion of him. I do have some picture of what he is like. And I would say that, I tried to be really flat, neutral through every segment of the series, and that's been a little bit more difficult because as you read more and more, and then compare the information that you're absorbing, for example, today to stuff that you kind of discovered a few weeks ago, and compile them into a puzzle, it becomes more. Gosh, it's difficult to find a good word to use right now, but it's hard not to be a little critical, to become a little cynical toward him. And
I think you used the word hubris. Did you not?
oh God, yes. I mean, and that's a term that is assigned to him not just by me. It's commonly assigned to him, and just in general, the behavior. If you want to argue the point that I just made, you don't have to say that he is full of hubris, but their actions absolutely were.
Right. Now, in this early stage, when we were first started to make the news, I mean, you went back and looked at KTM's financials over a reasonable period prior to pre-COVID and then moving through COVID. What did you find when you looked at those numbers?
I pulled annual reports as far back as 2013, which is all I could find. And I actually went through the trouble of compiling them into a spreadsheet. And then I went down a deep rabbit hole reading the tone and tenor of them. And what I found is mostly that this is a company that has been on a tear really since they were acquired in 1991, but just a particularly strong growth segment through the 20, basically from when they bought Husqvarna all the way up till about 2023. And in just about every way, they are a model for how to grow a brand, grow a product line, become more relevant, maintain their identity. They've just done an amazing job at that. I was looking at one point for some sort of smoking gun, and the phrase that I kept using is I was looking for something that indicated the point where they went into the ditch.
Right.
And I had a little bit of a difficult time finding that. I did find that their annual reports and goals in them and descriptions of the things they were doing inside of the company changed and got a lot more expansive in the 2018 version. And they started to communicate, at least through those reports, as a much larger global company would. Not a good, strong motorcycle company, but the language inside of it really changed. And that coincided with when they bought Gas, which is, you said earlier you thought they lost their mind when they bought MV Agusta, and I thought that when they bought Gas. And I was trying to find something that I could really point to, but everything was too subtle for me to really identify that. I think there was one thing that came much later, and that was their debt just exploded certainly in 2023. And it looks like they took on a lot of that debt, or started to take a lot of that on in 2021. But their financials just show great, strong growth in just about every segment of the company. And when this is sort of circles back to what I was saying before. When you look at the picture of them, they perform in just so many ways, and you keep searching for what went wrong, and you keep looking in one direction, in my case, which is up the ladder.
For our seventh inning stretch, some words provided by our sponsor. Picture this: you're in the garage, your favorite room in the house, and you're tuning up your engine with parts that you found on eBay. Every piece is just locking perfectly into place. You step back to admire your work, hands covered in grease. And because you're committed to riding that thing further than the odometer can even handle, you start thinking to yourself, you know what? I could probably also use some brakes, maybe a shock. This baby deserves a new air filter. So you get straight back to eBay. You can find anything you need there. It's absolutely surreal. From headlights to air filters to exhaust systems, all the way to those carbon fiber rims you've been fantasizing about. eBay is the stocked garage of your dreams. And you've got eBay Guaranteed Fit, because eBay knows DIY fixes can be major and mods are always incredibly intense. So you need to know those parts are guaranteed to fit every time before you dive in, wrench first. And on the off chance you order a part and it doesn't fit, well, don't fret, send it back. Simple as that. You know what you love more than your bike itself, and that is, of course, riding it. You're serious when it comes to engine maintenance and locked in when you're headed into a build. And that's exactly why you start with eBay. Minor fix or complete overhaul. You want to get your ride back on the road, and you've got eBay Guaranteed Fit. So eBay, in their largesse, created My Garage, where all you have to do is add your ride's info to get the exact parts that fit. When you see that green check, you're a click away from that part clicking perfectly into place. Well, now that you know all this, just imagine standing at the open garage door looking at a bike that you love more than anything, knowing that anything is possible, whether it's keeping it on the road forever or turning it into something that's never been seen on the road before. Because with eBay, your garage just got a whole lot bigger. Get all the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love. Now back to my conversation with Brian Price. How about the notion of startup? What does a startup typically do? And how and why did KTM, as an established company, start acting like And is that startup mentality just in our culture now? Is that kind of what drove them, I wonder?
Well, one of the components of the classic startup story is that you have that charismatic, romantic leader and a great idea, and usually it's unique, and it begins to gather some success, and as that occurs, the company begins to grow and expand and become more complex, and there aren't the structural or financial controls to keep everything going in the same direction in an efficient way. And so simply you begin to overspend and make bad decisions. And that happens time and time again in startups, especially in the tech industry. Um, and 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 I think that that was what I was imagining, what I was thinking of when I made that comment. That they began to go in so many directions with MotoGP and MV Agusta and Gas, buying bicycle companies and buying their suppliers and just blowing out their list, the quantity of subsidiaries that they had. It seemed that they were coming at us so fast that it seemed a little bit implausible. We were all questioning some things that they did at some point, but like happens so often, the picture that we had of them was of an immensely successful company, which they are, and certainly were. They were and they are. And so we just said, well, they must know something that we do not. But in reality, them going in so many directions, I think is a clear cause for where they're at now.
Brian, you did a great job of sort of laying out KTM's financial situation, and sort of complicating this even more is my cat, who will end up on my lap or meow. But what complicates this is that KTM was going through a quality control issue with some of its motorcycles. My wife bought a 2015 RC 390, and within very few miles, they had to replace the head and the camshafts and valves and everything. And this has been a problem, especially with their 790 and 890. Is that right? Motorcycles
Mhm.
have been particularly hard hit by that. And somehow this issue of the sort of reliability um, and quality control issues has become wrapped up in KTM's financial woes. So is this a part of it, or is this just a growing pain of a company moving production from Europe to India? What is that, and how does that weigh in to this?
It is a part of a much larger problem, and it was very surprising to see this emerge, and also fascinating, and really a bit of the branding team. I don't know if it's the branding team, but something that they have overlooked and should have been dealing with earlier, and should be dealing with much better than they are now. Uh, you know, KTM for the longest time, if you go on any forum conversation and you saw a discussion of Orange versus any of the Japanese brands, the poor guys that had the Japanese bikes would almost get beaten down sometimes because there was just such a passion from the KTM owners' side, and that was that always stood out to me in the past because I like all brands, and to some degree I'm a Honda guy because I've been around the industry so long, and because you know, uh, but um, but that was always striking to me, the passion that KTM owners had for the brand, and very suddenly. Uh, when the bad news about their financial situation came out, it was as if all of these little pots that had been on the stove percolating a little bit, one of them being the 790 cams, just boiled over and became a big giant mess all at once. And the amount of animosity that that began to come forth for the KTM brand from everywhere for all sorts of reasons was just mind-boggling to me. And the the most quantitative part of that, the most visible part of that, is certainly the cam issue, and and that is for a variety of reasons. One of which is how they have mishandled it, and they never really got out in front of it. Uh, they spent a good amount of time trying to tamp it down, which is kind of understandable. I don't think it was the right decision, but I can kind of understand why they did what they did. But there was so much pressure. Um, there's especially from the UK. There was a UK publication. I can't remember what it was, but they basically came out and called BS on a lot of what KTM was saying, and then KTM did come out and reply to them with, "Hey, yeah, we know there is a problem." But it came from everywhere. It came from small quality control issues on their dirt bikes. It came from how they deal with warranty. It came from their pricing. It came from their dealers. It just all at once, all of this negative brand equity emerged against them, and they have to deal with that. It is going to be a huge problem going forward because it is one of the single biggest reasons why they became so successful. If their core customers abandon them, if there is a perception that begins to take hold, even among a small segment, 20% of the consumers out there, if that takes hold, that's going to do real damage to their brand and their future.
Now, I bet you're going to say this is where the discipline comes in, because you've got all these things going on and you have to remember what each of these brands means. And I guess the gist of what you've been saying and alluding is that KTM sort of took on these brands without perhaps thinking fully of the ramifications of doing so. Is that a fair statement?
It's a perfect statement. We all have to have and maintain some sense of our own identity, and to not let our personalities develop into versions of themselves that we don't look upon and admire. We have everybody has a personal code and discipline in how they conduct themselves and how they present themselves. So we're all aware of that concept. It would be fascinating to understand what occurs to make us forget about our awareness of that when we are conducting business.
You talked about Mr. Peer, the man with his hand on the tiller, though who knows for how much longer, and how a lot of, in your view, a lot of the blame falls upon him. What was the structure? I mean, KTM has a board of governors, I presume, like a lot of other big companies. And how did he get so much control and seemingly unfettered capabilities of doing whatever he wanted to do? Or was the board fully in lockstep with his views? Or is he just that powerful and charismatic a leader that, is he like your Mr. Trump, for instance? I mean, is that his management style?
His management style is the Italians would describe it as very strong, and using the English language words for that probably oversimplifies it a little bit. But he is a force of nature in the boardroom and in the office, and he's hard to disagree with. He does not take disagreement very well. And there have been some stories of people who have disagreed with him, or even not even disagreed, but just offered up a differing opinion than the direction that he wanted to go in, and those people being reassigned or marginalized to some degree. He does not like dissent. He is a much more centralized manager, and incidentally, this is another little thing you're talking about, Kiska. Uh, from my understanding, and I'm fairly sure that this is true, Kiska manages the marketing and the communication and the advertising of KTM North America, which is another example of a centralized management structure that is questionable. Why they would not have some autonomy here, um, I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. It's just really surprising. Back to Mr. Peer, I know that he has a very centralized um, team, and decision making is follows that. Comes from that structure, that kind of organization, and you can say you can ask questions about the board, but I remind everyone that when this started to occur, first of all, there are a few things that don't make sense that make me think that it happened to some degree at the top. They began to see problems last year. If you go back farther and you look at what their attitude about COVID was, anybody who had half a brain knew that this big surge that we had in COVID was not going to be permanent. The question was whether we would retain 90% of it or 50% of it or 30% of it. And so you'd have to be nuts to think that you're going to retain 100% of it. And that pretty much seemed to be what they did. They did start to see some problems and hint at them in 2022 and certainly in 2023. They did not dial back the production until the end of last year, and we all missed that too. But again, back to what I was saying, I really want to know the significance of this because it's an extraordinarily big step. They fired their CFO in July of 2024, and this is conjecture, but I would guess that had to be either because he was in disagreement with them or because he was perhaps the cause of things and not transparent enough. But certainly that's a big event, and we'd all know what was more about what was happening if we understood that. And then when they issued their warning in October, they let all the board members go, even the T Trunklepose of KTM, the son of I think it's Hubert Trunklepose was the father's name. It could be the son's name, but the T in KTM, that is his family name, and he got shown the door. And then Mr. Peer brought in another person that he had a fairly close relationship with. So obviously that was in some anticipation of potential friction from the board.
Where are we now in this story? I know that it's sort of coming down to brass tacks with KTM, and we should fairly soon, in the next number of months, begin to see what's going to happen to this. Brian, what do you think is going to become of KTM? And before you answer, I always think of the old adage that if you owe the bank, $10,000, you're in trouble. If you owe the bank $800,000, they're in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think KTM is going away. And I suspect you agree with that. But what do you, with the research that you've done, what do you envision as KTM's future?
Well, two things. First of all, they are not going away, and that should not be questioned. How they remain is a big question, but will they remain? Without question, absolutely they will. The second thing is, I don't think that this is anywhere near close to any sort of completion or clarity. In fact, I see it getting increasingly complex and continuing to do so for quite a while. And the more that you delve into it, the more information that I gather about it, the more convoluted and complex it becomes. And the different resolutions for it are also really unclear. But the first thing to know is that they have predicted a drop in revenue, a massive drop in revenue over the next 2 years, and a massive loss over the next 2 years. And so that puts them in a dangerous position, a difficult position, even if they do remain, particularly under some iterations of what might happen. What do I think will happen? Well, I think there are a few possibilities, and then of course there's always some wild cards. I could be wrong, and I need to make sure that I say that. But first would be some variation of them remaining Austrian and Mr. Peer staying in charge, and that would require a lot of investment. They'd probably need about $2 billion, perhaps more, just to pay off their debts and absorb their losses. And then they'll need another billion or so more to operate, for the next 2 to 3 years. And they won't make profit on that. So they could potentially need even more. they're not that large of a company. They'd sold $2.66 billion of billion, excuse me, euros revenue in 2023, and so and they didn't make that much profit. So I want to be even the I want to, if I recall correctly, their best, most profitable years were in the 200 million, $300 million range, and I think it was $100 million in 2023. So it takes a long time to pay off $3 billion on that kind of profit, and they're going to contract quite a bit. So in some ways, I almost think that the most fragile or most painful way forward is if they stay Austrian and if he stays in charge. Um, I know that that's what everybody wants to occur. They don't want it to fall into foreign ownership, and I can understand that. But I really worry about what it will look like, especially for the employees, if that happens. The second possibility is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that isn't I mean there's also sort of and because this is 2025 and conspiracy theories are everywhere, we have to throw in a conspiracy theory or two, or none of the kids will listen to us. But one of the views is that there's something deeply cynical about this, and Pierre is knows exactly what he's doing, and he's going to buy back his own company for pennies on the dollar, and he gets to shirk all this debt and sort of gets a fresh start. And then another view is Bajaj, which I believe owns 49%, the Indian manufacturer, which has had a relationship with KTM. They make certain KTMs for the mothership. That they might come in and wait until KTM is bled out and then take what's left of it. And of course, there's a real history with this because, as we know, Land Rover, Range Rover, Jaguar are also owned by Indian companies. So this is not as unusual as it may seem if you're unfamiliar with these things. So what are the chances of those things happening? Is there a cynical view that Pierre is up to something kind of a certain kind of sleight of hand? And what about the Bajaj situation?
He's a brilliant man and has been described as ruthless. So I don't think that he would have a problem creating a way forward like that. Certainly, it wouldn't be against his code. How he does that, boy, I cannot. Yeah, how he accomplishes that, that's something that would be far more complex than I can understand or envision. And I've searched for somebody describing how that could happen, and I don't know that I see it, because remember, he has to pay back 30% of the debt, and has to do that within 2 years by Austrian law, and that's the offer that they've made. Bajaj, so they owned. First of all, there's his corporate structure is really, really complex, and so there's a top company, I believe it's Pure Industries AG, and he owns 100% of that. Pure Industries AG owns a portion of Pure Bajaj, and that was 50.1%, as I understand it. Something in 2021 occurred where they renegotiated or restructured their relationship with Bajaj, and they created it. I don't know. I could be incorrect at this because it's so complex. In fact, your site, kudos to Zach, he did a great job of reporting on it. But even he said this is hard to follow. They created another separate holding company and traded some of Bajaj ownership in Pure Bajaj AG for a share in that holding company. And so apparently now Bajaj owns less of the middle level of their corporate structure. And then the one below that is Pure Mobility Group. And Pure Bajaj AG owns 74.1% of that, and then the rest is publicly traded. So Bajaj has their hands deep into KTM right now. They are also a very, very large and well-funded company, and they have some advantages, I believe, were they to to make an investment or to end up with KTM, whether that's through a fire sale or just through negotiation. And I'm sure that that they want that. By the way, they got to that 49.1% ownership because KTM back in 2009, when the financial crisis hit, they had overproduced. They had to petition the Austrian government at that time to go on short hours and to get their workers some compensation. And you can almost see that in the production numbers. There were a lot of 2008 KTM dirt bikes, and there's not so many 2009s. There's almost no 2010s. But that's how they got into that position with Bajaj. They need money, and Bajaj bailed them out. They have lots of money. They produce for KTM now. They distribute KTM in Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia is one of the best and most important markets. That is, make no mistake, a bit of a gun to one of their limbs, because if they were to piss Bajaj off, they could do something to their potential future in selling future market potential in Southeast Asia. And so they have a lot of money, they have a lot of influence already, and they have a good amount of leverage. If they were to end up with the company, they also have a big product line, and you could see KTM's distribution channel, Bajaj sliding their product in right alongside of KTM, or perhaps even rebranding it Gas, or who knows what. So they have a lot of motorcycles that they want to sell, and KTM has a lot of outlets to sell them, and they know how to sell them. They know how to brand them, market them, race them, etc. And so that would almost subsidize a future version of the company, perhaps better than KTM could do on its own. CF Moto is another potential investor. They offered more. I think they offered $350 to $700 million. I think Bajaj was, 300. CF Moto offered more. They're smaller than Bajaj. I think they're about a third the size. They're also pretty darn well funded, though, and they have a great product line, and they produce for KTM. They distribute KTM in Asia. KTM distributes them in Europe, and so that relationship is sort of tightly woven, and would be hard to extract from. Also, there's a third company, Fountain Vest, which is Chinese equity, and I don't understand their desire to invest in it. They own a lot of other companies, and for example, I think they own Wilson, or own a share of Wilson, the sporting goods company. But private equity companies go around looking for ways to invest their money. I don't know that that they're really a serious contender for them. And then, of course, in any situation like this, there's some sort of wild card that I haven't anticipated. They brought in a new person who used to work for Remus, the exhaust manufacturer, and that man has experience bringing companies out of difficult situations like this. And if we're going to put if I'm going to put the conspiracy hat on, he has ties to Russian money. Yes, he has some history or a relationship with Oleg Deripaska, and he's a hard-nosed guy. And so it's not inconceivable that he could come up with some sort of way to extract them from their situation. And I'm sure that that's part of why he's brought in. I'm sure that's why he was brought in.
The Lowdown Show is presented by adbrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. What's your crystal ball future for KTM?
Well, Neil, first of all, in this conversation, I learned that you have possess a great knowledge about the motorcycle industry history. Compliments for that. We should definitely talk about that over a beer sometime. But I think that this is a bit of a recurring theme, a characteristic of the European motorcycle industry, starting from, at least from the early 70s, perhaps late 60s. There's brands like Montesa and Bultaco and Mako and KTM. They all were tragic stories in some degree. They all were tragic heroes, I should say, in one way or another at some point. KTM, though, they're the most successful one so far. And so they have gone farther, flown much higher than any of those other companies. I would say that BMW is pretty darn disciplined about knowing who they are and staying true to it. Um, I think that um, they ended up having to put their tail between their legs when they bought Husqvarna the first time, and they kind of recognized that. But BMW is very, very clear on their identity and consistent with it. And KTM is, as we've talked about many times, all over the map. Is it inevitable? It shouldn't be anymore. I mean, to become as successful as they are, they're supposed to know. I mean, they're just supposed to know how to do things like to manage the production schedule, to not be excessively optimistic over COVID, to recognize that, okay, if we're going to race MotoGP to sell 125s in Asia or 80cc bikes in Asia, uh, we might push that out down the line a little bit, or maybe start slowly. And they didn't do that. They didn't do any of those things. And so I always circle back to that was a lack of discipline. And what's the cause of the lack of discipline? Well, it was probably either a lack of discipline or hubris. I don't think it should be inevitable, though.
How will this affect KTM's reputation in the future? Because up until now, as we discussed earlier, pretty much had an unimpeachable past. They were this, again, as I said earlier, they were sort of this niche. They had the cachet of a niche brand and the market reach and penetration of a Japanese brand. It's like every company's dream. It'd be like if Ducati, sold 300,000 motorcycles and not 55,000 or whatever it is. I mean, KTM was the brand that kind of managed to do it. How will this affect this and the questions of reliability? How will this play out in the future for KTM, and will they rebound from this and become as strong as we thought they were?
Maybe there are two ingredients to that. One is the technical perspective, like you would see written in business books and branding, and they have a real branding problem, and they have done a miserable job at managing that. And they continue to do so. They should be out. Yeah, I keep thinking about this. You probably remember it. I don't know if most of the audience does, but in the '70s, Chrysler Corporation was in the basement, and Lee Iacocca took it over. And one of the greatest marketing campaigns ever was that guy, the CEO of the company, walking out on a bare stage with a car in the background, saying, "We're in bad shape. We really want to come back. We're going to do a good job. Please believe in us and support us." And it was such an impassioned message with such clarity that people bought into it. We want to buy into comeback stories, right? They have
Right.
done everything that they can to make more animosity be generated to them. They have done nothing to create goodwill. They have had no contrition or clarity or trying to connect with their audience, their customers in a deeply emotional way, other than talking at them or even down to them in the traditional company communication, corporate communication sense. And so the technical component of how they're going to play out in the future, they've done a terrible job, and they have real challenges. And from a technical perspective, I don't know how they regain that brand love that they had. The second part of that is people forget. People forget really quickly. And so it's entirely possible that the human factor of that is people just go, yeah, they'll move on to the next crisis, and they'll go, okay, maybe I'll buy a KTM sometime, and they'll completely forget about it. From my perspective, though, looking at it and analyzing it, they are in a deep brand hole, and they are doing a terrible job at managing it. Most of the work, permission, communication that would need to be generated to address that seems to come from Austria, from Kiska, and And I don't see anybody in their organization that the general public can look to and say, yeah, I want to, that guy inspires me, or that person, guy, girl, team, ad, they inspire me, and I want to, I'm rooting for them. I'm looking forward to their comeback. I think they've done a terrible job at that.
The Lowdown Show is presented by advrider.com and supported by ebaymotors.com. Brian, you don't spend all your time researching KTM things. You run a business in Oregon, in Bend, Oregon. So tell me a little bit about your history in the motorcycle racket and how it led you to Atomic Moto, your current project.
I am professionally the luckiest man in the motorcycle industry. Like everybody in this business, we enter it because we love motorcycles, and it's a really strong passion, compelling passion, and that was also me. I managed to go to work for Fox Racing starting in 1990 when they had 25 employees. And I left there in 97, and then I went to another apparel company, Alpine Stars. I lived in Italy over there for a few years, and I went back to Fox for a while. And they were both fantastic jobs. I mean, just outstanding, amazing jobs. I met fantastic people. I learned a ton and did some really cool things. At a certain point, I wanted to structure my life more around my love for motorcycles and moved to a really cool area, really bitchin' town. And so I moved to Bend, Oregon. And the plan was, well, instead of living where my work dictates, I want to do the work that is consistent with where I live. And Bend, Oregon is where careers go to die. So I started this little company selling what I was familiar with, motorcycle apparel and protective gear, and kind of choosing the segment of the industry that appeals to me, because I know it and I can speak the language better. And so I sell protective gear, mostly boots, apparel, and I've been doing it since 2009. And it's been a fantastic project, and I really enjoy it. And it does give me the ability to do side projects like the KTM article. And so, yes, Atomic Moto.
Now, tell me, are you going to be struck by a rock in the head and get all this hubris and start buying up all these other little apparel companies? And you're not spending too much time with this KTM story and getting any bad ideas, are you?
No, I'm in no danger of that because I feel I have discipline and I don't have hubris. One thing I will say, though, and it's really important, I wish I had said it earlier, the bulk of my customers are KTM owners. It's certainly the most represented brand among my customer base. And if they sneeze, I catch a cold. And so this is not just interesting to me. It's a little bit frightening because it will affect me. It will cause some challenges for me also. And I would be wrong to say that I have the same amount of skin in the game that anybody connected with the company has, but I'm concerned for my business and how their situation affects the motorcycle industry in general.
In closing words provided by our sponsor, just picture this. You're halfway through a DIY motorcycle fix, tools scattered everywhere, and boom, you realize you're missing a part. Well, it's okay because whatever it is, it's on eBay. They have simply everything. Brake rotors, lights, and tire exhaust systems, whatever you need, and it's guaranteed to fit, which means no more crossing your fingers and hoping you ordered the right thing. All the parts you need at prices you'll love, guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love. Thank you for listening to The Lowdown Show.